Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm really pleased to have Daniel McAdams with me once again. He heads up the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be back with you again.
Always good to have you. We like to have you on a weekly basis to try to keep up with what is really going on in the world, as opposed to a lot of the homogenized, propagandized stuff we get here in our press. Of course, I remember, Daniel, as I grew up as a kid, I always thought that Izvestia and Pravda were a bunch of lies, but we did nothing but tell the truth. So we could always trust CNBC, or at that time it was CBS, ABC, and NBC, I guess, right?
Yeah. Yes.
A little later came along CNN, and these were the truth tellers, I thought, in my mind. And I think most Americans still feel that way, that we have it right, and anybody outside of this country or anybody in this country that has a different view of the mainstream must be crazy, or they must not know what they're talking about. But anyway, that's why we like to have you on every week, to get a different perspective, and one that I think is much more objective than what we're given day in and day out here. I'd just like to ask you, because the Ukraine is such an important issue these days. Some people are saying it could be as serious as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it seems like neither side is willing to give in at all. And one side points fingers at the other and accuses them of wrongdoing. But can you just give us a little bit of an update, what's transpired over the past week or so in the Ukraine and where we stand right now?
Sure. Well, over the weekend, there was increasing violence in the eastern part of the country. The anti-Kiev protesters in the east, who were using a lot of the tactics that the Kiev people used just 2 months ago to gain power with the support of the U.S. The guys in the east who did not approve of the coup that happened in February are using the same tactics. And although the U.S. supported when it was done with their guys in the west, now when it's done with guys who are not theirs, they're terrorists and they're bad guys and this sort of thing. So it really is an example of double standards. But there have been some skirmishes in the east. The Ukrainian army, whenever it's engaged some of the people in the east, is basically melted away. So it's really an army that is not only not ready to fight, but in some cases I've seen reports where they're not even being fed. So instead of going and attacking the checkpoints and taking the people away, what they're doing is they're taking the food away, which is really quite sad. That this is how they're being treated. But the mayor of one of these towns, who had been with Yanukovych and is now on the U.S. sanctions list, was shot in the back from a sniper in the woods over the weekend, and may well die, may well have passed away by the time this is aired. So that shows that the snipers are at it again. But what's most significant, I would guess, is that on Monday, the beginning of this week, President Obama is in the Philippines to announce an expansion of the U.S. empire. If you remember, the U.S. was forced to leave its bases in the Philippines shortly after the end of the Cold War, which would make sense. But now President Obama is expanding, and we're going to have some new bases in the Philippines just to irritate the Chinese. Of course, the Filipino people have been protesting against it. They don't want any part of it. But what Obama announced in the Philippines on Monday is yet another round of sanctions against Russian individuals and companies in retaliation or punishment or whatever. I don't know what the purpose of it is, but in reaction to the fact that the Russians, according to the U.S., have not lived up to their requirements, their obligations under the so-called Geneva Agreement of a couple of weeks ago for de-escalating the Ukrainian crisis. So this is more retaliation by the U.S. And unfortunately, the Geneva Agreement was that all of these armed groups that were not legal groups should disarm and should de-escalate. But the U.S. has interpreted it that only the other guys should disarm. So they have a creative interpretation of what should happen. And so when it doesn't happen, I mean, in a conflict, which side would be stupid enough to be the only one to give up their weapons?
Right.
Basic.
Right.
And the other point about this really is that the people from the eastern Ukraine who are protesting were simply not invited to Geneva to take any part in it. Which is, how can you impose an agreement over the heads of people? And when the shoe was on the other foot, and the U.S.-backed coup in Kiev was taking place, the U.S. demanded that the people involved in the coup had a place at the table.
Right.
So again, you see the double standards. So,
Right. Yeah,
so
the Geneva Agreement, it seems to me, very selectively do we follow it. It just irritates me to no end to hear people on television talk about how the other side is ignoring the Geneva Agreement, and then we do it all the time ourselves. So,
well, it was purposely vague anyway. I think if you actually read what they agreed upon, it's incredibly vague, and I think it was that way on purpose, so that so that the U.S. could say you're not living up to it, and therefore we're going to put on more sanctions and this sort of thing.
How convenient.
And the Russians, to their discredit, have been foolish enough to sign on to yet another one of these agreements.
Vague agreements.
They should very well know by this point that will be used against them. So,
yeah.
Somewhat foolish, I think.
Well, it would seem so. Switching gears a little bit, you had a number of really thought-provoking pieces on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website. One of them was headed, "Is it time to attack Kuwait?" Now, Daniel, I thought Kuwait was supposed to be friendly to the United States, so why would you pose such a question?
Yeah, and I hope, I did say toward the end of the piece that it was a Swiftian jest, meaning that I was sort of exaggerating for a modest proposal. But the point is that, as you remember very well, President George W. Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And that's when he started his attacks in the Middle East. Well, there was a report that came out in the Washington Post at the end of the week last week saying that the largest supporters of Al-Qaeda in Syria is the government of Kuwait. So by any metric, you would therefore conclude that Kuwait is with the terrorists. So sort of half in jest saying, so when is the U.S. going to recognize this? The point is, as you know, the Washington Post really is the mouthpiece of the U.S. regime, and what's happening is that the U.S. is shifting considerably the way that it's arming the insurgents, the rebels in Syria. As you may have read earlier this week, and over the past couple of weeks, the shipments of the TOW missiles, these advanced armor-piercing anti-tank missiles, have been delivered for the first time to the Syrian rebels. And the U.S. is working closer with Saudi Arabia to deliver these and other lethal weapons to the Syrian opposition. And sort of Kuwait's finding itself on the outs. And so that's why you see these critical articles in the Post about Kuwait.
Oh, interesting. I mean, all the double standards, they just keep hitting you in the face if for people that are really looking at trying to find the truth here, beyond the daily propaganda that we get. The Arab Spring that took place here a couple of years back, it seems to me that it fits the pattern. Now, I know there were a lot of issues there. People were going hungry, food prices were rising, and so forth, and I suppose there's nothing that will rile a population more than if people have trouble putting food on their tables. But do you think there was concerted effort on the part of NGOs to destabilize things and get somebody, if not a democracy, or to get a democracy, but our kind of democracy? I mean, I'm thinking of certainly of Egypt, which has become not more democratic, if anything, more totalitarian, more tyrannical than ever at this point in time. But I noticed on one of the interesting articles on your blog, you talked about at the Ron Paul Institute. You talked about there was something to do, I think, with a secret military base that the United States had implanted that has, in fact, since, I guess that was in Libya, and it's in fact since has turned out to be a refuge for Al-Qaeda. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's the case. It's funny. I mean, I would like to see anyone point to Arab Spring, point to the U.S. interventions in North Africa, and show me one success. Egypt is an absolute disaster. Earlier this week, we saw from Egypt 700 supporters of the elected government that was overthrown, the Morsi government. Another 700 of its supporters have been sentenced to death.
Good Lord.
So, here's one way to win in a democracy: just kill all of your opponents.
Right.
So there's certainly nothing to point out there. And as you point out, we wrote about Libya this past week, and it's quite ironic. The U.S. Special Forces secured a secret base that was meant to be a place where we trained Libyan special forces to fight Al-Qaeda. but the base has now been occupied by Al Qaeda,
Yeah.
who are controlling it. So Libya is an absolute disaster. Interestingly, there was another report that came out. It was an independent study done by some former intelligence officers and think tank analysts, and they came to the conclusion that really the U.S. knew at the time, before the U.S. started attacking Libya, that Benghazi was a hotbed for Al Qaeda, and they essentially, the word they used is the U.S. temporarily switched sides. They wanted to take out Gaddafi so much that they essentially, wittingly, teamed up with Al Qaeda to overthrow him. And the point that I made in the piece is, does the war on terror even make any sense anymore?
No.
But these things are happening.
It certainly doesn't seem to make any sense. It just seems to be generating enormous amounts of chaos around the world. But maybe it makes sense from somebody's point of view, Daniel. Maybe weapons can be sold. The military-industrial complex is happy as long as we keep warring. And I don't know. There's got to be a huge amount of money being spent on these wars that somebody's profiting from, right?
And sure, and there are a lot of jobs at stake, too. Look at NATO's behavior in the Baltics on the Ukraine question. NATO is as giddy as a schoolgirl, with the chance that it might have a new lease on life, and it's cavorting with these leaders in the Baltics who just want to have more U.S. troops on their soil. It's always the U.S. that has to defend these countries. Of course, NATO was not set up for the U.S. to defend these countries who are being antagonistic toward their neighbors. Mm-hmm. But there are plenty of jobs. There's plenty of weapons that are going to be sent over there. Maybe even some basing in Poland, which is, as you know, is a tremendous shot in the arm for the local economy. So there's something in it for everyone.
Yeah, it just seems to me. Go ahead.
Except the taxpayer in the U.S.
Well, the taxpayer, of course, and the middle class is being decimated right now. That's another story, which sort of leads me to another issue that was on the Ron Paul Institute website. There have been a number of instances recently where the United States federal government has taken assets away from Americans by force and not in an orderly manner, it seems. The latest being this case of a rancher in Nevada whose family has been farming that land for, I don't know, a couple of generations, going back a long time. And Ron Paul actually made a speech in Congress in 1997 warning that the BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, which is, I guess, a department under the Interior Department that I'm very familiar with because of the mining industry that I'm involved with. The BLM, the United States government and the BLM control such a huge amount of land in the West. And I guess Ron Paul warned about the BLM and arming the BLM, and it was, in fact, the BLM that came in with armed force to take property away from this rancher. But can you tell our listeners a little bit, could perhaps summarize Ron's speech in Congress about this very issue?
Sure, and I don't know if you noticed, we put some pictures up. One of our readers sent us some pictures that he had taken from the ranch in Nevada while he was there. And I feel like I'm jaded a lot of times. I've seen it all, but I honestly was shocked when I looked at the photographs of these BLM guys dressed as if someone actually even commented on our page saying this is not true. This is pardon me. This was taken in Iraq. We don't believe you. Yeah. And I said, just zoom in and you'll see the BLM patches on them. I mean, these guys are decked out like soldiers. They have these high-powered rifles that they're aiming at unarmed Americans. And, I was truly shocked. And so my colleague at the Ron Paul Institute, Adam Dick, I went back and dug up this tremendous speech of Dr. Paul's back in 1997, where he was warning about this exact thing, which is arming federal agents and how they're really making Americans fear their government. Mm-hmm. And here's a great quote, by the way, if I can if I can read it. He said, this is back in 97, "Force and intimidation are the tools of tyrants. Intimidation with government guns, the threat of imprisonment, and the fear of harassment by government agents puts fear into the hearts of millions of Americans." It's talk about being ahead of your time.
Yeah, well, Ron definitely is, and of course, this tyranny. What strikes me, Daniel, is that you can't just be a tyrant overseas and not have it affect you internally. It seems to me. I mean, there's a connection there, isn't there?
That's a great point, Jay. And I think a lot of people that like this very muscular foreign policy don't realize that it certainly comes home to roost on our shores. And we see the way the U.S. government is treating Americans, just like they've been treating foreigners overseas now, when they're decked out in this military gear, they're pointing automatic weapons at unarmed people. It's just incredible.
And then the other part of it, of course, is keep Americans impoverished, so they have to work 80-hour work weeks or depend on the government for their sustenance, for their bowl of porridge, so to speak. And then you've got them controlled, and it seems to me we have slipped into a tyranny here. I don't believe that most Americans yet realize what is starting to take place here. I don't believe that most do. I'm fearful that it won't be very long in which everybody understands that something horrible has happened here. I don't know. I mean, I just hope and pray that I'm wrong about that. But I just get a sense, as James Rickards said on my show last week with respect to some of the currency and international issues, his sense is that things are really starting to speed up. And I think a lot of what's going on that you cover, Daniel, on the having to do with with the foreign policy is all part of the equation of what is taking place internally, and it's not unrelated. In fact, I think it's totally related. But Hugh, I want to put another question to you, and we're just about out of time here. But here's another question for you, Daniel, and I pose this to my listeners, and I'm looking forward to some of my listeners coming back and answering this. But Putin has a 13% flat tax. Now, if you live in New York, as I do, and you have a good year, state, city, federal, and all that, you're paying in the high 40s, mid to high 40s, total income taxes. And now our government, as we just discussed, is taking property away from citizens, not through normal court orders, but through military force, essentially. So I put this question last week to my listeners: what government is more respectful of private property and thus life itself, the United States or Putin's Russia? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't live in Russia. I don't live under their system, so I don't really have much say over it. It still assumes that the government has a right to 13% of your labor.
Right.
But as you say, compared to what we have here, and the propaganda, as you started this segment with, about how we're so free here in the U.S. I mean, I love this country, as do you. But when 50% of our labor is confiscated and sent to do things that we don't agree with, it is a form of tyranny. And it doesn't mean that another country's better. In my opinion, it means we have to work twice as hard to fix the country that we live in, rather than trying to think that we can fix everything else overseas. Mm-hmm. But, it's really interesting. I was over the weekend, I took the kids, and we went to a national park where they had this sort of canal ride on a boat. And the person who was doing the interpretation was complaining about how terrible it is that the parks don't have any money and they can't take these boats anymore and everything. And I don't support, U.S. Taxpayer money going to these parks, but I was thinking as I was sitting there, it's funny, they always seem to have enough money for all of this empire building overseas. Right. And nobody seems to question it.
Right.
It's just incredible. Not to say that it should go into the parks, but if we had more money in our pockets, we might want to voluntarily support these sorts of things.
Yeah, and a lot of other worthy things, and even maybe arguably more worthy, like taking care of your own family.
Absolutely.
And poor people around you who would, I think the government really discourages people coming together to help each other out. When just let Big Brother do it, and don't worry about it, and as if there's no cost to that. Daniel, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us again, and we look forward to doing it again next week.
Thank you so much, Jay.